Hi guys. So you want to build a light show. This video is designed for people that are very new to the hobby and need a very basic understanding of what it takes to put a light show together. This hobby can be overwhelming for most people. Part of it, the terminology can be confusing, and another, the learning curve can be steep. For example, say you have a model that takes 150 pixels and you purchase 3 strings of 50 pixels and you plug it into that prop. In xLights, when you go to define that model, it asks you how many strings. A lot of people would think it's 3 because that's what you put into it. But in xLights, a string actually means how many ports you're going to use. So if you're only going to use one port, then the number of strings is 1, and then you put down how many pixels are on that, and it would be 150. But I'm not going to go into details on that. So in this hobby, there's literally dozens, if not hundreds, of ways that you can do each thing. You have pixel spacing, network configuration, controllers, controller types, pigtail connectors, voltage, and the list goes on. People want to know what the best way is. Of course, you want to do your show what's the best way. The problem is there's hundreds of ways to do everything, and they all are right, and they're the best way. It's the best way for the person that's doing it. The best way is the way that works for you and you understand. So in this video, I'm going to go over a very basic overview, and I'm going to try to provide some more detailed videos in the future on each of these sections. So in a light show, there's 4 basic items that you need. You need the sequencer, you need the player, you need the controller, and you need the lights. These are just the basics on what you need to make the lights go blinky flashy. But wait, there's more. I'll have some additional bonus stuff at the end of this video covering some other items that are probably pertinent but don't fall under the 4 basics. So in a light show, you can make a very loose comparison of components needed to that of an orchestra. You've got the composer. He's the one that makes the music, and that's like the sequencer. Then you have the conductor. And the conductor, he will coordinate the show, telling them when to start and stop and how to play. And that's a show player. Then you have the musician and the light. Musician and their instrument. And they're closely tied because that's how a controller is, and same thing with the musician and their instrument. They're very closely tied and work together. And that's your controller and your lights. So like I mentioned, the sequencer is like a composer for a symphony. The composer takes their vision, creates a written plan of this vision, and in turn creates some sheet music. With the sequencing software, you take your vision and decide how, when, where, and what color you want each light to light up, and it's usually synced to music. The sequencing software has many tools to simplify this task by using what's called effects, and that will figure out all the details of what lights to light, when, and what color to the effect that you choose. When you're done, the sequencing software will create what is called a sequence, which is a file to tell every light what color to be at what time, kind of like the sheet music is. The 2 most popular sequencing programs right now are xLights and Vixen, and they're both free. In my opinion, xLights is way more powerful, it's more actively updated, and it's constantly being improved. xLights also has many tools that greatly simplify creating your show and configuring your controllers. There's tons of free sequences available, along with several sequence vendors that do a great job of creating sequences, but you will still need the sequencing software to adapt these sequences to fit your show. None of these people have a show that's exactly like yours, so you have to modify it so that it fits in your show. The next person in the game is the show player. Like I mentioned, the player is like the conductor of an orchestra. He tells the orchestra when to play and keeps them in sync. That means that you'll need some sort of player to send out the sequence data to the controllers to tell them when to play and to keep them in sync. Most show players will also give you the ability to create schedules to start and stop your show when you want, and to create playlists so that you can play several sequences in a particular order. The 2 most common show players are FPP and Xschedule. They're both free. and they both do way more than just play sequences and playlists in a schedule. xSchedule is software that's run from a computer, so you will need a dedicated computer or laptop to run your show. It is slightly easier to get up and running than FPP, but it does require that you have a computer just to run your show, and it doesn't need to be a very powerful computer. FPP is free software that's run from a small single board computer like a Raspberry Pi or BeagleBone. FPP actually has two major components in the software, the player component and the controller component, and a bunch of other stuff, but that's the two major components. The advantage with FPP is that you do not need a dedicated computer, and Pis or BeagleBones are small enough that you can actually put it in the same enclosure with your controller. You don't have to, but that gives you an option. You probably don't want to put your laptop out in your front yard, and then it would be hard to waterproof it and everything else, but the Pi or BeagleBone is very small and can fit in there. There's also a bunch of controllers that are FPP based. So if you have a controller that's FPP based, the controller can be both the player and controller at the same time. And not all of your controllers have to be FPP based. You can mix and match most controllers. So the controller is like the musician and the lights. It gets instructions from the show player, aka conductor, and then outputs that information to the connected lights and lights them up how they're supposed to be. Some of the more popular and trusted controller vendors are Microsybe, and this is a DPI Pixel Protocol controller. It's a hat that goes on top of a Pi. You've got xLights. This is a standalone type controller. It needs to receive E131 or DDP data from another source. It's a newer controller on the market, but there's been a lot of really good reviews and experience with it. You have xLights, which is a BeagleBone-based controller, which means that it is using FPP as well, so it can act as a controller and as your scheduler. You've got the Falcon line of controllers. The Falcon controllers have been around probably longer than any major controller company out there right now, and it's a very good, stable product. Then you have the xLights line of controllers, and the xLights line of controllers are FPP based as well, and he has a lot of different controllers, and he's one of the main developers on both xLights and FPP, so there's a lot of attributes that make it real easy to use this. So a lot of people, when they go to buy a controller, they figure more ports the better, right? That's not always the case. There's actually two types of controllers. There's a local port and a long-range type controller. A local port controller is where you have the controller and your pixels will connect directly to that controller. And you usually have 4, 8, 16, 32 ports to hook up to. The long range is where you have a controller, but you typically have a network cable going to some other location, and then you'll have a receiver board in there, and those typically only have 4 ports, and that's where you'll control the pixels. And in that remote receiver box, you have to have a power supply and the receiver and run a cable over to it. So if all of your props are centrally located right close to each other, and you've got a controller right there next to them, the long-range type controller might not be the best for you. It might create a whole lot of extra components that you don't need. I'll be doing a video on explaining the controller types and how all that works, so hopefully that will clear up that in the future. A lot of people, when they first get started, thinks that you need one port for each prop. That's not the case. You can chain props on top of each other. You're only limited by what the controller is able to do, and a lot of controllers can control roughly 1,000 pixels per port. It can't necessarily power it, but that's beyond the scope of this video. So if you go with more than one controller, they usually don't have to be the same type or even vendor. They all play nice together. But I do have to give a word of caution. If you use Google searches, don't rely on the search results or the vendor reviews. There is a vendor out there that's known for buying Google ads that if you search for a certain controller, his store will come up And it also has a video where it's comparing his controllers to the other person's controllers and explaining how terrible these other controllers are, how poorly designed they are. Yet his designs on a lot of the things are worse than what he's explaining in the videos. So be careful with the Google search results. So then this video, I use the term lights because most people are just starting this hobby are only looking to make things blink and flash. And the typical lights they're trying to control are pixels, LED strips, and P10, P5 panels, commonly called tune-to signs. And with the pixels, there's even different types. So with the pixels, you've got bullet or square nodes, C9 nodes, strips, and LED panel. But in reality, in the end, people control way more than just LED lights. You've got floodlights, moving heads, fog snow machines, and people even incorporate it into their house lighting and lighting inside their house. So you're really only limited by your imagination. So to recap, we're going to put it all together. You got the sequencer, and you'll use that to create or modify your sequence. Then the player, then you'll upload that data, or if it's X schedule, it already has it on there so that it knows what to do, and you define your schedule, when you want to play, what you want to play. Then you have your controller, and it will, when it gets the information from the scheduler, will play when you want it to. And when you put it all together, you get something like this. Now, I don't have any audio on this because otherwise I'll get a copyright ding, but that just kind of gives you an example of what it could look like. So even more, after watching this video, you probably have way more questions than I can answer in a reasonable amount of time, but I'll cover a few of the more popular ones. So how do I get started? My recommendation is to download xLights, create your layout, and get an idea of what you might need. That'll give you an idea what type of controller you want to use, how many pixels, what props you want, and everything else. So, what type of spacing for my lights? This is a very common question in regards to outlines and megatrees and a lot of other items. There's a few factors that will influence your decision. One of the biggest one is the distance that your audience is, but the biggest influence is going to be your personal opinion. Some people like 2-inch, some people like 3-inch. There's people that even like 6-inch. It depends on what you like, how you want it to look. 5-volt or 12-volt pixels. This topic is about as opinionated as the Chevy versus Ford or Coke versus Pepsi debate. In my opinion, I feel there's a place for both, and I actually use both in my show. That's not for everybody, just like all 12-volt isn't for everybody and 5-volt isn't for everybody. It's mostly personal opinion. But 12-volt pixels are able to span a longer distance and illuminate more pixels without doing power injection, and I'm not going to go into power injection, than 5-volt pixels. But 5-volt pixels use less power than the 12-volt pixels, and they're just as bright. The 5-volt and 12-volt in the end are just as bright as each other. So, in my opinion, if you got long runs like outlines and things like that, use the 12-volt pixels. If you have a dense prop like a singing face or a matrix, then use the 5-volt pixels, and then it's real close to power inject, and it's very simple to power inject, especially on the dense props. How much is it going to cost? And the answer is it depends. There's a lot of people that put out there a rule of thumb as $1 a pixel. But I think that's really hard to put it that way, because what if you buy 1 pixel, but you buy a $1,000 controller and all this other stuff? It doesn't work out. So it really depends. But to get a basic controller that is going to be expandable and probably able to control your entire show for many years, For example, a K8 from xLights, and a couple thousand lights and the pigtails and everything that you need to put it together is probably going to cost around $1,000. Now, you could do it for less, or it could cost you more, just depending on what you're going to do. And like I said, it's about personal preference. Almost everything in this hobby is personal preference. Asking what is the best controller, what is the best company, all of this is like asking what's the best color to paint your house. You're going to get dozens of answers, and they're all going to be correct. You just need to pick what your preference is. I'd suggest starting small. Don't go into getting a whole huge show because you got to learn how to make everything work and everything else, and it might be a little more stressful. Start with a few minor things. Start early. It's going to take time to get it all figured out. And start with a few things. Get the controller figured out. Get your lights figured out. Figure out how to sequence. Or if you purchase sequences, figure out how to adapt them. And then grow. Every year, most people, once they start this hobby, every year they're adding on. After the first year, you'll have a good idea, and then you can just go gangbusters and really expand. But I wouldn't suggest going real crazy your first year. So, common mistakes that people make. One of the things is buying the wrong type of controller. Like I mentioned, you have the long-range type, and you have the local port controllers. If you got a big wide open lot and you got props that are all over the place, you try and use a local port controller, you're going to have long runs of cables going to those props, and you're going to get voltage drop and have a lot of problems with it down the road. Just like if you've got a whole bunch of props that are in your yard and they're fairly close to your controller, like a mega tree and candy canes and arches and mini trees and all that stuff, and you get a long range type controller, you only get 4 ports on each receiver. So you could be buying like 7, 8 different receivers and all the cables going to it and all the power supplies you need. And that might not be the best for you. You can make either one work. So don't stress too much about the type of controller because you can make one or the other work. It just might not be the most efficiently. Another thing, people want to save money in this hobby, and it's understandable. You don't want to spend a lot of money. But you get some people that they end up buying the cheapest that they can find. And especially like pixels, they'll go to Amazon and buy cheap pixels from Amazon. And the wiring is super thin, so you're not able to light up as many lights. You got reliability problems, a lot of things like that. So don't always buy the cheapest that you can buy. Also, too, a lot of times they'll buy a very small controller, like a DigiQuad or something like that, which the DigiQuads are great controllers, don't get me wrong, but their intent is that they're going to have a decent-sized show down the road. Well, the DigiQuads probably don't work really well if you have a good size show. So I'd suggest buying a controller that you're going to be able to grow into. And you don't have to buy a super big one, but buy a decent one. Another one is people taking shortcuts and trying to save money. For example, you've got a 48 pixel candy cane, but when you buy the pixels, they come in a 50 count string. I see people all the time wanting to figure out how can I leave these 2 pixels in and continue to run my show. There's ways to do it with null pixels or a secondary model for the 2 pixels, but I found that most of the time it takes more time figuring it out and maintaining your show in the future than it would be just to cut those 2 pixels out and move on. And you're probably going to need those pixels for a repair down the road. If you have a lot of props that have different lengths and you know ahead of time, when you buy your pixels, buy them in a custom length string to fit it. And you'll find out that in reality, you're not really spending any more money to get the custom length string to fit. A lot of times people save money. For example, making their own Coro props. Now, if you have all the right tools and everything to do it, that might be a good choice. But, like they say, time is money. I built a some singing faces one year. All the vendors were too busy and weren't able to get what I needed, and I decided to build some. And I spent several days on these props, and I ended up saving myself probably about $60, and it was about 4 days of work. My time is worth way more than $20 a day. But some people, if they have time, that's what they want to do, and that's fine. There's nothing wrong with it, but just kind of look at the overall picture. So where to buy? So if you're buying fairly small, I'd recommend going to some of the local vendors. Here's some of the more known vendors. Now, there's a whole lot more than this, and by all means, this isn't the only ones that you should buy from. You have Wired Watts, xLights, and Your Pixel Store. There's a lot of other vendors out there, but do your research. If you're doing a large order, I would suggest contacting the manufacturers, Ray Wu and Paul Zhang. I use almost exclusively Ray Wu. He's been very good to me. He's done a great job for me, and I've never had any problems. But a lot of people, when they get the quote from the Chinese vendors, they get sticker shock with the shipping price. And they go, oh, hell no, I'm not going to buy these. They cost way too much shipping. But what they don't realize is that they're saving a lot of money on the item itself. If you have a decent size order, I'd suggest getting a quote from the Chinese vendors, Ray or Paul, and then get a quote from one of your local vendors and get everything exactly the same. And especially if you're going with the Chinese vendors, get all the little items that you need, like the pigtails and wires and things like that. You'll find out that even though the shipping costs might be astronomical, the bottom line, it might be cheaper with the Chinese vendors. And what matters to you? Do you care what the shipping is, or do you care how much it's going to hurt your wallet? If you're like me, you care how much it hurts your wallet. So if you have a decent size order, I'd get a quote from both of them and then buy who ends up working out the best for you. So where to buy Coro props, things like that. A couple of the better vendors out there are EFL Designs, Buy-Coro Studios, and Gilbert Engineering. I can tell you EFL Designs puts a lot of work into submodels and doing a lot of neat, cool effects with their models. Yeah, he probably puts a lot more personal effort into them. But Buy-Coro Studios has been around for a long, long time and has great products as well, and so does Gilbert Engineering. And these are not the only ones. These are just some of the more popular ones. So feel free to go wherever you want to go. Just some ideas to look at. Alrighty, so like I said, this is a very basic overview. I'll have future videos in the future on all these different aspects and explaining what they are in more detail. But this kind of gives you an overview of what you're going to need and maybe help you on your research mission. This hobby does have the best support of any hobby I've seen, and the nice thing about it is it's all free. Here's some of the resources to help you in your ventures. Probably the best all-around resource out there is the xLights Zoom Room. I got lucky and found that while I was waiting for my controllers and pixels to come in, and it was probably the best thing that helped me out. If you have time, go out, hang out in there, listen to people. You might find that you hear something, and when you're doing your show, all of a sudden you go, wait, I remember somebody had that problem, and this is how they fixed it. So I've got a link up here to a video on the Zoom Room, how to use it, but it's probably the best all-around resource. There's people in there 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year. Granted, there might be times that you don't have the top-notch experts in there, but you still have some people that are fairly knowledgeable. If you go in there and you don't get the problem solved, come back a couple hours or the next day or something, and you might get it resolved. But for the most part, you'll go in there, get your problem fixed in just a very few minutes. Make sure you watch the video so that you understand the protocols and how to work it and everything else. It explains how to navigate through the Zoom Room as well. You've got falconchristmas.com. It's a forum site. It's very active. You get a lot of people in there and responses and everything else. So there's a lot of things in there, and it can really help you out a lot. Granted, you might have to wait a day or two or a week to get your problem solved, but you've got a lot of people in there and it's very active. You've got the 101 Lighting Manual. This is probably the best written resource out there that covers just about every aspect of our lighting hobby. And it's located on the AustralianChristmasLighting.com website. So you have to go to that website and join, and it doesn't cost anything to join, and you can get that manual. And it's a really good resource, and it covers a lot of stuff and goes into quite a bit of detail on a lot of the things. And you've got a gazillion Facebook groups. I got a word of warning with the Facebook groups and with the Falcon Christmas Forum groups. You post a question, you're probably going to get some good answers, but it's a lot of times that you'll get answers that are totally wrong. So don't get frustrated if what you get told doesn't work, but just stick with it. You'll get it done. Come to the Zoom room, we'll get you fixed up. But, for the most part, this hobby isn't difficult. Once you kind of understand it, it's just getting over that little bit of understanding it. So that's about the end of the video. I don't really have much more to cover in this. If you have any questions, shoot me a message. And down below, I've got some links to a whole bunch of different resources and everything else that will probably be helpful. And have a great day.